Great to have people here. I'm Abby Rose, the CEO at Vidacycle, and we make apps that support observations as a key tool for understanding what works on the specific farm or a vineyard. Many of you may already use or be familiar with Sector which is our app specifically for vineyards. Sector makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, understand soil health and biodiversity, track vineyard activities block by block, and much more. And actually in November last year, we released the Regen dashboard in partnership with Nicole Masters and Integrity Soils. And that allows you to benchmark and track your regenerative viticulture journey using the 10 Regen indicators, as well as get tips and tricks from Nicole on how to improve them. So yeah, in general at Vidacycle, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And we're always exposed to amazing stuff that's happening. And then we realize that not enough people get to hear about that stuff, especially some of the real implementation details of a regenerative approach. So really, this Regenerative Viticulture Series is about connecting the conversations and sharing knowledge and highlighting the work of the amazing practitioners like Felix Egerer, who's here today, as well as others as brilliant resources if you want to take a more regenerative approach. So yeah, please ask any questions in the Q&A area on the webinar rather than in the comments if you can. Yeah, you can type it in there and it'll be visible to everyone, and then you can upvote any question, someone else's question that you're also interested in. And we will come to go over those questions in the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar. So please do add them as you go, and then I'll come to them at the end and we'll get as many answered as possible. Okay, so it's such a pleasure to be talking to Felix Egerer. Felix and I have never actually met in person, I realized. But I have had the pleasure of a number of in-depth chats with you, Felix, and you have such a deep understanding of the processes happening in plants and soils, whilst at the same time having years of experience actually managing vineyards and farms regeneratively. So that's an amazing combination. Felix's extensive education and expertise has transported him to positions in the US, Australia, France, and Germany. And Felix, you now tend to the 50 acres or so of grapes at Unsworth Vineyards in British Columbia. And I actually came across you, Felix. It was when you were a student on the Integrity Soils Create program. And I know that you now coach on that program as well. So yes, you're definitely a great contribution to the viticulture world, and we're really excited to have you here today. So I guess to get started, I would really appreciate if you could share a bit about your vineyard, where you're working right now, and maybe just a bit about your background in general as well.
Absolutely. Morning, everyone. Well, morning my time on the West Coast, on Vancouver Island. Thank you very much, Abby, and all of Vidacycle for having me on today. It's been great to follow the series over the last few episodes with lots of amazing minds from all over the world, and it's really nice to be asked to be part of it and get to share some of what we do here on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. My name is Felix. I've been doing wine my entire post-secondary life. I'm originally from Germany and started working at a winery, doing an internship there in 2010. So it's been a minute or two, and have never looked back since. Spent some years going to school there for viticulture at Geisenheim University, and then transferred to UC Davis for another couple of years. And in the off times over summer, started working harvests, mainly cellar work, all around the world. Eventually realizing that vineyard work is a lot easier to come by because everyone wants to be a winemaker, and they never get to see the light of day. So it's nice to be outside and have a job where you get paid to be today in the sunshine, which is nice. And basically started doing viticulture full time in 2018, and started managing a vineyard in summer of 2018 in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia's interior. Um, did that for 4 years, 5 years, up until 2022, fall of 2022, and decided to move on to a next adventure. My partner and I moved out to Vancouver Island, which is a huge island off the west coast of British Columbia. And I started farming there for Unsworth Vineyards, taking over management on, yeah, as of last week, we're done planting. Actually 55-ish acres of estate vineyards and some grower properties. Real interesting place to work, to farm, very different from before. And I farm anything from 8 kilometers from the beach to 100 meters from the beach. So very interesting context switch from the interior, which is essentially a desert, to a very, I think, Canada's only true Mediterranean climate, with lots of rain in winter and then none as of pretty much now through summer, where it gets really dry and hot. In 2021, well, I'd always been interested in regenerative farming and found a really good small group in the Okanagan, a handful of viticulturists who we would meet and talk and buy cover crop seed together and just start experimenting around, because there really is not much written on any of it in viticulture, because it's such a highly specific and specialized niche farming that is confined by trellis materials more often than not. And yeah, we just started trying things and discovering more and more, and that's kind of the rabbit hole that I never came back from. And there's just, the deeper you go down, the more twists and turns it takes. And in 2021, that led me to Nicole Masters' Create program, and that's where Abby and I met, as Nicole was working and still is working with Vidacycle on the region indicators and Soil Mentor, and it was one of the tools that was used in the program, and I've been using it more or less regularly ever since, and have been fortunate to help teach the subsequent versions of the course that were based in the US. Then last year's was in the UK, and this summer in September we're starting in Create Yellowstone in Montana. So it should be a lot of fun. And it's just great to meet practitioners and coaches from literally all over the world. We've had Bulgaria, we've had Kenya, all over Australia, New Zealand, Europe. It's really fantastic. Sergio, who was one of your first guests, I think, on this series, maybe even the first guest, was a student in the Create course last year, and so I finally got to meet him. Lots of great minds, and yeah, that's what I do in a nutshell. I look at plants. I talk to plants a lot.
Well, that's a good place to start. And actually, yeah, maybe we can start there, because I know that you've been using at Unsworth, you've been using step testing regularly over the last few years to support vine health, and then ultimately with the aim of lifting the base nutrition levels of your vines from season to season. And I guess in a way you could consider SAP testing as one of the ways that you can talk to your vines, or you can listen to your vines. It's one of the ways that you can understand what they're communicating. And so, yeah, when we spoke, you shared that your nutrition levels of your vines have come back higher this season than ever before. So maybe you could talk me through, like, what's that journey looked like a bit, and yeah, how have you achieved that?
Yeah, absolutely. Plant sap testing, for all of you who might not be aware or fully in the know of it, is a method of nutrient testing where you, well, the lab you work with expresses the intercellular sap. So what's in between the cells floating around the leaves, you submit a leaf and petiole depending on the lab, and then measure the nutrient content in that, versus more traditional conventional nutrient testing. You submit tissues, they get dried, they get burned, and the ash content or the nutrient content in the ash is measured. It's often compared to blood testing versus muscle tissue testing. So the blood testing is more acute, where the tissue testing is kind of to look into the past. It's what has been accumulated in the tissue. And then sap testing is what's happening right now. And so it gives you a little bit of a look into the future. You can pick up deficiencies that you might not see in the field, but that are already there because the plants are short nutrients of some sort. And then you can correct it by, in my case, most often applying a foliar spray of nutrients. When I do my regular fungicide sprays, which in an organic system is more often than I'd like. But using that for the last few years has been really helpful to really address specific physiological processes in the vine and really pull everything apart. It's like, look at, okay, protein formation, how do I convert nitrogen? What nutrients play a role in that? Or photosynthesis, what nutrients, especially in the micro realm, actually play a role there? And depending on the time of year, shifting the balance within the plant from more vegetative to reproductive energy and nutrient use, and really dialing in when what nutrients are applied. We have vines that hyperaccumulate potassium no matter where you put them. That's just the nature of the plant. And that makes it hard for other cations to be taken up, especially calcium, magnesium, which calcium being one of the main components of cell walls, and magnesium being hugely important in photosynthesis means that you can severely limit your plant's resilience and performance just by nature, by the nature of vines being a potassium hog. And yeah, just this year, we just got our first round of sampling in because it's been a really slow season, and are seeing higher overall nutrient levels compared to last year, which is quite neat. We did have a wetter, cooler spring, so there'd be more availability from a soil moisture point of view. So context is always important. But some of the adjustments that we made in the off season with soil amendments and with early foliar sprays are already showing, and especially on the nitrogen conversion side, really having no measurable nitrate or ammonium in the sap is something that's a really nice feeling when you want to end up with complete proteins and amino acids that yeast can use later on, and not have the plant have to waste energy to convert a lot of nitrogen or detoxify it over its growing season.
Yeah, maybe can we just dig into then the specifics of that? So in the early part of the season, what is it correct to say then you're focused on the photosynthetic potential or the of the plant, and so what you're looking for then is whatever the cofactor is of the photosynthesizing and converting all of those nitrates to or nitrogen to amino acids. Is that fair, or is that correct? What did you look for in the first part of the season, and then what will you look for now that you're coming into bloom?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's I'm a very staunch follower of John Kemp's work or his assembling of other people's work. He's very good at it and provides it for mostly free to the world, which is amazing and a great resource. And he has some really good webinars on reproductive versus vegetative nutrients, and then also critical points of influence throughout a plant cycle. So each species has a different distribution of those points of influence. For vines, it's generally it's like bud formation and then flowering, fruit set, cell division, and then cell expansion and ripening post-harvest. And so for vines in particular, we're just starting to flower here, so a little bit later than normal. And the interesting thing with vines is they don't have two distinct cycles. You start vegetatively, but also form reproductive organs, and then as soon as you have bloom, you still have a little bit of vegetative energy going on, and at the same time you're growing your berries, so your reproductive organs. And at some point the energy goes more into the berries, and you stop growing ideally in a balanced vine canopy and really focus on ripening all that fruit. And really teasing out those points of influence for vines has been super interesting, and looking how can we get a lot of growth early in the season, but get high quality growth, really high quality wood, really focus on calcium, boron early in the season to push that growth, and not touch nitrogen until after flowering at all, because you really don't need it. The nitrogen nitrate will make plants grow green and lush, but it doesn't go anywhere because those proteins don't have anywhere to move to. Now that there's berries, proteins have somewhere to move to. And shifting that around, same with potassium. Potassium really starts playing a crucial role now that berries are forming and cells are dividing. And only then would I consider applying potassium. Now, in vines, rarely have to do so because they have so much potassium to begin with. But teasing out my mission for this year and probably the next decade to tease out the physiological processes, and then really what goes into them as far as nutrients, enzymes, cofactors, vitamins, you name it, to be able to address it, and really supplement what the vine wants and needs when it needs it.
Yep. Yeah, because I think so the two that you had teased out already were it's molybdenum for the nitrates, is that correct? And then also manganese for the photosynthesis. Can you maybe just explain those two just quickly?
Yeah, so photosynthesis has a whole bunch of different nutrients that are involved. You have the chloroplasts that are nitrogen, and we're surrounded by magnesium, with iron playing a role, and then manganese governs the splitting of water. Manganese is one of the nutrients that is, or micronutrients, that's not often thought about. And if you don't split water, then you have no photosynthesis. So it's one of those where a little bit goes a long way. You hardly need any, but you do need it. And manganese also governs potassium uptake and the potassium balance in the plant. So you kind of get a two for looking at your manganese levels. Molybdenum in nitrogen management, nitrate reductase, has molybdenum as a cofactor. And so without molybdenum in your plant, you're very inefficient at reducing nitrate and forming those amino acids and complete protein. And again, a little bit goes a really long way, and you need it. And I've seen over the years, whenever my lab that I work with, they return nitrogen conversion efficiency numbers and a percentage of how much of your nitrogen in the plant is still available as or present as nitrate and ammonium. And getting the molybdenum right and increased has always increased those conversion efficiencies up to, I just got back at 100% for the first time, which is nice to have. Now just got to keep that going through the rest of the season. Nitrogen is not something that I need to necessarily worry about. I'm very fortunate to be farming on 5 to 6% organic matter soils with ample amounts of clay and loam, and plenty of water and irrigation to put it on when I don't have water. So it's a lot easier to do than in my previous position where we were at 1% organic matter and sand, essentially, in what was a desert, more or less.
Yeah, it's such a totally different ball game. Okay, great. That's really helpful. And I think, yeah, sometimes understanding the value of SAP testing and these very micronutrients and just how important they can be in optimizing the vine's performance is not always obvious, or it's hard to find information on that. So it's amazing that you just elucidated on that. Thank you. And I guess I just wanted to bringing this all together, because obviously we're talking about the Regenerative Viticulture Series, and in a way, how does this all relate to like building soil health and the soil food web, and in the end, are we aiming to work with that biology, and how does this relate to that for you?
Absolutely. I mean, biology is key. And we try to foster it, encourage it to do its thing as much as we can, given how hard it can be in a somewhat degraded system to get biology going and to not just putting on inoculants or carbon and then it's all going to work. If the soil physics and the soil chemistry don't support that, then you don't have a house for the biology to live in. And so it's like doing all these things at the same time, looking after the plants, boosting their performance at the same time as building the house for the biology and encouraging or increasing biological levels, and going the plant route is seems to be for me the most effective, the fastest one, with the highest ROI, because I am working in a system where I do a foliar spray of sorts every 7 days, every 10 days, and can add a nutrient or multiple nutrients into it and kill two birds with a stone. And then once those plants are working on overdrive, they produce excess carbon that they can then share or will then share to a certain degree with the soil and then feed the soil food web around in the rhizosphere. And then this whole process can actually start. We do grow cover crops. We do try to avoid unnecessary disturbance where we can. I refer to myself as a recovering no-tiller, um, and have moved away from the really dogmatic approach of not wanting to disturb any soil. If I don't do that here, I'll have a forest. I'll have blackberries and ferns within a couple years. And so really managing disturbance to a way where it suits my business, as well as the environment,
Yeah.
is important to me. And we work with soil sprays. We built a clone of the Chaos Spring sprayer, like a vortex sprayer applicator that we can spray out seed. We can spray out unscreened compost up to 8 millimeters, and really focus on that as soon as we have some soil moisture in fall, throughout the winter when conditions allow, and in spring, just building biology, getting different seed out there to grow different species.
Got it. So you do that, you see, yeah, they kind of, it works together, and this is just one of, so feeding the plants, foliar feeding the plants is just one approach to building carbon in the soil, essentially. And
Absolutely.
do you see in the long run that eventually you'll be able to use less foliars because the soil will provide more of the nutrition, or a more complex, holistic nutrition?
Hopefully. I think that we grow mainly grafted grapevines, and I think the graft union, even though physiologically there's a connection and the plant lives and does its thing and behaves like a plant, I still believe that there is a slight disconnect, because the rootstock will attract certain microbes that suit it in the rhizosphere, and those might not be the same as the scion. So I think every grafted plant will need support to a certain degree to really provide us with the most nutrient dense fruit, the highest performance, the best plant health. And I don't know if we can strive to work towards it, and we will, lowering fungicide input and moving to softer chemistry or away from chemistry altogether and to more biological products. But there's just, yeah, my brain says that that's something that the graft will just always pop up and prohibit us from having a completely self-sufficient system, because we are extracting every year from a fruit perspective, and something has to be put back in to a certain degree. Now, will it change? Yes. I mean, the nutrients that are being put in this year that are being sprayed on are different from last year, and different levels, different amounts, different timing of the application. So it's very dynamic and not a recipe that's just plug and play every year.
Yeah. And actually, maybe just jumping or going on from that, could you just talk about some of the like practicalities of like how often are you testing, and are you testing the whole vineyard, or are you able to use certain blocks as indicators? Because I know it can be quite expensive.
Yeah, definitely. It's not cheap. depending on where you are. We work with a lab in the US. And so each time I ship samples, it's around 200 Canadian dollars to get them there. Each sample, I managed to buy them in bulk with some grant money, which was convenient. So I bought a set of, I think, 100 samples that'll last for a few years. But I've settled on a couple high return blocks that historically where the fruit goes into more high return wines, and large blocks too, just to be able to spread the cost out. We generally try to get it in one sample before bloom, which is a single leaf sample because we don't have lots of canopy at that point. And then after bloom, it'll be sample pairs, so an old leaf and new but photosynthesizing leaf to be able to compare the distribution of mobile and immobile nutrients and see the balance there. In a perfect world, I'd submit, I don't know, 6 samples a year, but really hard to argue from a financial point of view. And finance is very important in a farming operation. So if we get 3 to 4 in, I'm hoping for 4 this year, the way this season is planning out. Trying to time it so that we wait long enough after we spray on nutrients, 3-4 days as per the lab's recommendation, and then try to get the results so that we have enough time to purchase product and make a decision as far as what to add and how much before the next spray.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. I do have just one more question. I'm just curious. We didn't talk about this, but I remember when talking to Sergio, and I saw Sergio is actually here on the call today, but I remember when talking to him, he had one of the ways he'd reduce costs was some of the inputs he'd started to kind of mix them himself, or do you do any of that, or do you have intention to do any of that kind of thing?
I have all of the intentions to do everything, and reality gets in the way sometimes. Yeah, I saw he was just doing it this last week. He's been fortunate enough to go to the coast and collect seaweed and work with a couple fishmongers or a fishmonger to get fish waste and make his own liquid fish. I would love to do things. We have plans this year of going and pumping seawater and then applying seawater to our rows later in the season and in fall to the soil. And once I find an area that has an abundance of kelp, then maybe go and harvest some and try to process it ourselves. Fish is a little trickier when you need large volumes. There's really good product available here. There's a lot of fish processors on the coast, and they make hydrolysate to reduce their solid waste into something liquid, and then you can find ways of acquiring that if you find a quality source. We do make our own compost and are gonna take that further and add a vermiculture operation to that. But a lot of the other things at the beginning right now, it just makes more sense to bring them in from a trusted source and then use them. But special projects are always welcome.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to move on now away from the sap testing and to talk a bit about plants as indicators, or often weeds as indicators, because I know that observations are a key part of your vineyard management, and that you do use the weeds to help you understand what might be happening in different places. So yeah, maybe you could share a bit about what you have observed in the vineyard and what those weeds mean to you, and how do you approach then changing things?
Yeah, it's really interesting starting a new job. This is my second growing season here, and there was no handover period. The previous viticulturist had already moved on before I joined. So I got a few records and had some other staff who could chime in from on the production side, but a lot of the learning and trying to figure out the lay of the land, quite literally, was being outside and walking and looking at things, and plants really helped me with that. I'm really glad that I have had the chance to learn over the last few years before having to do it for myself. um, rather than having to figure it out as I go. But in an environment here where we have fairly heavy soils, um, lots of rainfall, we get 1,000 mil, 1,200 mil over winter. For the North Americans, that's 40 inches. And it's from October to April usually. We can get not necessarily standing water in the vineyard, but wet spots and random springs that pop up once the groundwater level is high enough. And so walking around and just looking at what's growing where and trying to make sense of it, and then comparing it to soil chemical results, plant tissue results, and just observation throughout the season has been really key. Big one here is we're short calcium. The soils are not really high in calcium, and so there's an abundance of plants that whose job it is to accumulate calcium from deeper layers in the soil and bring it to surface. Buttercup being one of the biggest, best indicators. Also, buttercup likes wet feet. So you'll find them in parts of the vineyard that hold a lot of water, and then where grass grows 3 times as fast as everything else. And it might need a little more attention and just a few more buds down to balance that vigor in the plant. Docks, similar thing, really tap rooted, trying to open up soil and make phosphorus available. We're in dairy country, so there's history of lots of liquid manure applications in field prep. Really high phosphorus in the soil, but not necessarily anything to liberate that phosphorus. And so indicator plants trying to do it, and then looking at sap testing and seeing lower phosphorus levels. It all kind of makes sense. Good old horsetail loves wet feet, and there's plenty of that around the wet edges. And then also in systems, because they're so high in organic matter, looking at hints towards succession, where the land and the soil are shifting from a more primary grassy level of succession, which is what vineyards are usually farmed on, to more shrubby, going into woody areas. We're developing a new property, and there's some corners where the land fiercely is holding on to the trees that it wants to grow, and blackberries and ferns. And so those are areas where then my tool of choice is a little more tillage, mainly deep ripping and undervine cultivation, to just knock back the succession level to a more primitive level, away from forest, more to a grassy area or pasture area.
Interesting, because also is that, I guess, divines generally sit somewhere in between in that succession kind of pathway. We've got obviously starting, or my understanding of it is starting in a bacterial setting, and shifting over to a more fungal dominated setting. Soil-wise, I'm talking here in terms of the microorganisms. And so essentially, are you saying that if you want to have vines be productive, you need to make sure they don't shift too far into the fungal dominated realm? Or do you
I
not
don't know
think?
if I know enough to in the details to make any comments on it, but
Okay.
vines are survivors.
Yeah.
They will grow. They will grow. We see that where they grow in volcanic areas where there's really not much as far as soil goes. And we see them, their natural habitat is riparian areas. So there is an abundance of moisture and there is a decent amount of undergrowth, but that gets cleared out through floods, usually in spring. And so I think if you look at the literature, a lot of it is like, oh, it has to be heavily fungally dominated for vines, but to be efficient at nutrient cycling and really get the biggest bang out of your soil microbes, bacteria need to be present, and protozoa to then eat those bacteria and excrete the excess nitrogen often and other nutrients that they don't need for their own growth. So having I don't know if there's exact numbers. I don't like targeting specific balances of anything. It's more about, is it working or is it not working? And then how do we encourage that, and how do we just get to higher levels from an abundance point of view of everything, soil microbes, species, plants, really everything, and away from the strict monoculture vine with tillage, fine tillage every other row, and golf green in the other rows.
Yeah, totally. Okay, great. Actually, before we move on to abundance, I just wanted to talk a little bit about something that you mentioned that I was fascinated by, which was you said in your previous role, once you did change that inter-row management, the soil so obviously what we're talking about here is as you change management practices, the soil does start to shift and it will start to show you different indicator species or things will change. And you said you got indications of a massive potassium release happening. Could you say a bit more about that? What happened there?
Absolutely. Um, so our soils generally where a lot of the nutrients are held is the clay portion, the clay colloid. Every soil has a little bit of clay in there, a tiny clay fraction, maybe sometimes more. And those are really stacked layers that have negative charges. And then in between those layers, if you had to represent it in a drawing, it'd be like a layer cake. And in between you have different cations, potassium, magnesium, calcium, that are held in between those layers, and attracted to the negative charge of the clay colloid. And their positive charges, you have magnesium that has two, so it kind of pulls it together. Calcium has two, so it also holds it together. And those atoms, potassium is fairly small, magnesium is somewhere in between, and then calcium is actually fairly large. You could see it as golf ball, tennis ball, and then basketball from a sports ball reference. And if you have fairly depleted soils, tight soils, a history of a lot of potassium application, a lot of tillage, and collapsed soils, then those will be held together really tightly by potassium rather than magnesium and calcium. Magnesium too, and then generally not a lot of calcium. And as you flocculate the soils, you introduce functional calcium into the system and roots, then slowly but surely potassium gets removed from the soil and calcium inserted, and the layers push apart and flocculate to a point where the charges holding the potassium in aren't strong enough anymore because the layers are so far apart, and that potassium gets flushed out. And so one of the first signs I was taught by Nicole and I've seen it in the field since, of your soil healing, the first few years, you might see a flush of potassium indicators. That could be lamb's quarter, thistle sometimes, and other plants that take up that available potassium and turn it from an inorganic form into an organic one, and then rot down as waste, to avoid it from leaching out. So don't be scared if you all of a sudden have a bunch of lamb's quarter. Tasty too. The quinopod, it's basically spinach with a little bit more of an oxalic kick to it. Very tasty. But yeah, seeing that happen, hearing about it and then seeing it happen is really nice.
Mm. And I guess it's just part of the shift because the potassium it comes out and then it will be dissipated through the different weeds and through the different plants. So it's not sticking around forever.
Yeah, it's got to go somewhere. And the undesirables, we call them weeds, undesirables, they all have a job, and more, each plant takes up, or most plants take up certain nutrients over others, and then make them available, make them bioavailable, turn them from inorganic to organic forms. And yeah, that's why indicator species work, and that's why you see a response like that when your soil starts to flocculate, which is ultimately what we want. Goal would be to have a soil that's 50% pore space and 50% soil, and really nice and airy and crumbly, so it can hold a lot of water, hold a lot of nutrients, and hold a lot of air, and for microbes to have access to oxygen, and roots too.
Totally. Great. Thank you. Thanks for explaining that.
Mm.
It's great. Yeah, the visual of the layer cake, very helpful for me to think that through. Okay, and then I wanted to just talk a little bit about, you told me that fostering abundance is ultimately your job, and you just happen to grow grapes. And so I wanted to know, like, how can you tell when you're fostering abundance? Like, what have been the indicators that you've seen at Unsworth that have started to come into play and are letting you know, okay, yeah, now it feels like we're fostering abundance.
I think it's a little too early to tell here because it's only been
Okay.
a season and change, but in my previous job, it was different or more species, a shift away from really just grassy growth in the mid row to a more diverse sward. Some of that introduced, some of it just popping up from the natural seed bank as the conditions changed. And then insects, insects by sound. The vineyard sounds different. You walk and there's just life all over the place. Reminds me of, I don't know, as a kid, I had to clean the windshield of the car all the time and the lights because there was so much bug splattered. And now that I don't even know the last time it happened, it really doesn't happen anymore. We've lost that. And to drive through a vineyard or walk through a vineyard where it's just buzzing and you're swatting flies and other winged insects out of your way as you walk, and spiders and all those things, and then to see bird numbers skyrocket as a result because they're feeding on those insects is just, it's amazing. And it's not just diversity of birds. I think it's a little harder because they each have individual habitats and really specific food sources. But just abundance of birds means
Yeah,
we have to net more and pay
totally.
more attention during harvest. But it's not just starlings. It's really the more native birds that belong here, robins and stuff like that. It's a beautiful sight to see. And then after the birds, you have then birds of prey who also chase them sometimes. And yeah, it's just wonderful seeing a system really just explode with life, team with life.
And if you were to say, like, looking back on that, then, like, what do you think were the key management decisions that you made that actually had the biggest impact on fostering that abundance? Like, if someone was just trying to, if they were starting out and just, what were the key decisions that really got you there?
Definitely shifting use of chemistry away from systemic. I mean, I have no proof of that, but I think that moving to sulfur, oil, and biologicals has really helped. Removing unnecessary mowing, recreational mowing, um, has been a huge thing, and changing the timing of it, letting it really grow wild up until bud break, because there really is no reason to mow. And then when I mow, we generally try to mow one row, skip a row, mow the next one, and leave that longer grass, longer sward, whatever is growing in there, a little bit longer so that the fauna has somewhere to go and it's not just turned from really nice habitat to a wasteland within a few minutes.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we go in a couple weeks later and mow that row down. The height of mowing, not mowing half an inch off the ground, but really lifting it, helps with regrowth too, which is something that I'm looking for here to slow plants down and really manage growth, manage vigor. Doesn't work in every system, but it works for me. My previous job, I was crimping, so I didn't mow at all and just flattened it. I think Nick talked about that a bit too, and just leaving the plants in place and the habitat in place and just shifting them from growing tall to growing flat. Even works with alfalfa lucerne if you run over it often enough. Um, what else? Introducing other species through cover crops,
Yeah.
not just flowering species, but grains and everything else too. Forbs that all grow different heights, have different root systems, looking at underground biodiversity or abundance too.
Mhm. Okay, great. I mean, that's a good list. And then, okay, I'm just gonna just say, so if people have questions, Harold, I've seen your one question, so I will get to that in a second. But if other people have questions, now is the time to ask them, because I'm going to keep asking my questions. And then we will start promptly at on the hour. So don't miss out asking your questions is what I'm trying to say. But I'm going to carry on and just move to one of the other things we discussed is like as part of a regenerative vineyard and what does it mean to do regenerative viticulture. One of your concerns or one of the things you're thinking about as you're managing your vines is, or even how you manage the canopy is like being able to have or foster abundance for people as well, the people in the vineyard. And so you gave the example of like the way you're managing the canopy, you sort of thought about it in terms of needing less people, but being able to pay those people better. Like that would be one of the outcomes you desired for a regenerative system. So yeah, maybe you could tell us a bit more about that and how do these more social factors enter into your decision making?
A good topic. It's a big topic. I don't think it's talked about enough, unfortunately. Um, but the social aspect of farming, it like farming, we're losing farmers across the world, across all farming domains, all agriculture. I think the average age of farmers in North America is, if it's not in the 50s, then it's very close to it, or even north of that. And nobody wants to take over that land because it's hard work and it generally is known to not pay well. Viticulture, if you're making your own wine, you're actually a fairly high return business, and having staff, like if you look after your staff, they're going to look after you. And I'm doing what I can for my plants to put them in a position where they can perform at the highest level possible, and we're supporting them with pretty much everything we can think of and everything they tell us that they need. And so often that is not the case. Operations won't do that for their staff. It's like people still get paid minimum wage for field work because it's quote unquote unskilled labor, which is one of my least liked terms. And people are like work long hours in the heat. And that just, you're never gonna get to the best you can be as an operation. And from a quality perspective, if your staff isn't looked after, it doesn't feel good. I If my staff, like if someone who works with me doesn't have to worry about whether or not they're going to make rent and pay for food and buy their partner flowers and put some money away for retirement, then they're going to be able to focus more on what they do on a daily basis. And maybe they will just take that extra 5 minutes because they have the energy to go and just wash down one of the tractors, and that means on the far end the tractor lasts another 2 years. Or they make a note of something they see in the field because they had the time and they wanted to just go for a gander and look at something. And to a certain degree, that's mechanization for us, where we look at more efficient equipment that works across two roads at the same time, which lowers the operating cost and then makes room to pay operators more money. But it can be as little as a good friend of mine, a mentor, Steve Faulkner. He works for Oak Ridge in the Yarra and the Mornington Peninsula in Australia, and he wrote a really good article for one of the Viticulture Australia leadership booklets, and he talked about the importance of, or the significance of, a can of Coke. And he mentions how just bringing a flat of beverages to a picking crew or to a crew in the field is, on the grand scheme of things, when you're running millions of dollars worth of budget, a tiny little blip. It costs you almost nothing, but the appreciation for it on the far end, what it means so much more if you bring people a chilled fizzy beverage when they're working hard in the field, or you cook them a meal. You buy them a meal if you don't have the time to cook it, and make the time to do so. And if that means that a half-hour lunch break turns into 45 minutes, they will likely stay an extra 10 minutes to finish up their rows at the end of the day. and maybe not even tell you about it. And it's those things that giving back to the people who give everything for you, give so much for you, that is really important to me as a manager, and yeah, as a farmer, as a regenerative farmer, or a person who wants to regenerate systems, because really, like, regenerating people's health, I mean, we work ourselves to death. I'm the worst for it. I work insane hours, and I'm trying to work on bettering that, um, because it's being a little hypocritical, because I'm not taking the rest that I want others to take,
Yep.
for myself, and I neglect myself over the plants sometimes. And it's gotten a lot better since I've actually paid attention to it and made it a focus. But it's just so important. Asking your staff, it can be as little as like, what do you need from me right now? What don't you need from me? How can I support you? Do you want closer support? Do you want me to just observe? And now that I'm getting to do that and build a team of my own and really just ask people, like, what do you want? Maybe they don't want to drive a tractor. Maybe they'd rather focus on irrigation, and then that becomes their job rather than making it tractor focused and they don't really enjoy it. At the end of the day, we do everything. Like, we just spent a day digging a hole to find a irrigation main the other day, and it doesn't matter who you are, if you're senior management or a temporary laborer. It doesn't matter. We're all the same. We're farmers at the end of the day, and we all gotta. If I have their backs, they have my back, and that's how the system works. Without that, the system doesn't work. Such a crucial part.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the social side of regenerative is something that isn't talked about that much. And I've even been in scenarios where people really push back on not wanting it to be part of the conversation. So it is good to bring it in and recognize it's part of it all, and that it does actually exist. It's part of the business structure. It's inherent.
It has to be.
Yeah.
It has to be. You see it, farmers, a great example that I was introduced to over the last couple of years is wild farming in the UK, where the farmers know they're going to get a certain price and they're committed to, and they can just live and do the best they can and don't have to choose the harshest fertilizers and fungicides just to cut costs and do as few applications as possible. And when you really pay people for the crop they produce, and they can actually sleep at night, and they can go, I don't know, buy their kids ice cream and not have to worry about it. It'll be amazing. Like, it's amazing what comes out the other side.
Totally. Okay, I'm going to ask Harold's question here quick so we don't run out of time. Oh, he asked for a summary of the layer cake. Well, maybe in the summary section. Yeah, actually, maybe that's something that we can draw out when we share the video next week. And we'll draw it out, and we'll maybe even draw something, who knows? So we can get a visual going of the potassium, calcium, magnesium, and how that all works together.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've got a drawing somewhere. If you shoot me an
Okay.
email, Abby, then I can
Yeah,
share that.
that would be great. I was just thinking one thing we missed, or I missed, sorry, I think I missed, that we can just quickly go over now is we talked a little bit about a comparison. You do a comparison. So at the end of the season, I think you also do some tissue analysis. So you've got your SAP analysis kind of going through, and then you're doing a tissue analysis to understand the accumulation of nutrients. So could you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that SAP is kind of the acute what's happening right now, even though we compare old and young leaves, but we're measuring what the plant is moving around or not moving around, picking up. And then tissue is what's accumulated, what's inside the cells when you do the tissue tests that are ash based. And so at the end of the season, I like to take leaf blade tissue, standard tissue sample, for the same block that I was SAP testing at, and then set those numbers side by side. There's a lot more literature data on nutrient levels for traditional tissue testing, And so I can see it's like, okay, I was riding the first part of the season, I was riding on the lower end of, say, sulfur or calcium in my sap, and we did apply it. It never seemed to go deficient. And then in the tissue, how did we do? Was that enough to get us into an overall acceptable level, or were we riding too far on the lower end of the scale, or on the high end? Say for something like nitrogen, were we too high with applications that we did? Did the plant end up taking too much into the cells? And then does that line up with anything else that we saw in the field? Did we have to, God forbid, hedge a second time? Or did we end up with a lot of laterals, and as a result, maybe more botrytis over harvest, because it starts to rain during harvest here. It's not an if, it's a when. And botrytis has always been a challenge, will continue to be a challenge in this environment, really high humidity too. So having that comparison, and then maybe even comparing it to soil chemistry, and seeing like, oh, we have this supposedly available in the soil. Did it end up in the plant or not? And taking, if you have indicator plants, taking an indicator plant, like, oh, look, what is it trying to do? And looking at a tissue test there vis-a-vis maybe our cover crop or pasture sample if you have livestock in your field or something like that. So trying to take use your data as many times as possible, because you pay to get it. So you might as well get the most you can out of it.
Totally. Okay, great. I'm gonna stop there. Thank you so much. Really appreciate sharing all of your information and practices and all the knowledge you've gleaned over the years. It's amazing to hear it all, Felix. I really appreciate it. For anyone listening, if you want to hear more about Sector Mentor, you can email us on info@viticycle.com. And we will send a follow-up email early next week with a video of this recording, and a bit of a deep dive into the layer cake we were talking about earlier, and also links to where you can find out more about what Felix is doing. And I guess, Felix, you do a bit of coaching as well as working at Unsworth. And then, yeah, just to say, this is the last session we're doing for now on the Regen Viti series for this kind of segment. But we will be sharing some exciting news about our Regen Hub, or that's what I'm calling it for now, which it's a free resource essentially. And it's a few different key resources that allow for accessing the kind of amazing practical insights from everyone who's been part of the Regen Viti series over the last few years, as well as information on how to do the regen indicators and some of the monitoring that can really help you understand where you're headed with your system from a regen perspective. So that will all be available. And just to say thanks so much. Thanks for coming along. And we will, surely pick this up again. Who knows when? Maybe in a few months here. So
thanks so much, Abby. It's been a lot of fun as always. I appreciate our conversation so much. If anyone wants to get in touch, just feel free to share my contact email.
Okay.
So if you want to reach out to Abby, then you can get in touch. I'm an open book, and it's fun to share. We were just talking about that earlier, teacher versus knowledge sharing, and the difference in feels out of those words. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity and the chance to be part of such a great series, and looking forward to working together in the future.
Me too. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.